Thanks everyone for joining us this evening as we welcome back Barry Bergdoll to our virtual podium, presenting Architecture in a Time of Upheaval, Projecting the Future in the French Revolutionary Decade 1789 to 1799. Many of you joined us back in April when Barry delighted us with his talk on Jean-Jacques Le Queux, and we are very happy to see many of you registered here again this evening. If you happen to miss that lecture, fear not. You can find it as well as a lot of other ICAA video content right here on the ICAA website. Go to classicist.org/articles/videos, and you'll find an amazing array of videos that have been recorded. This lecture is being presented as part of the Françoise and Andrew Skurman lecture series in classical French architecture, and is underwritten by our lead annual public program sponsor, Rank, and our seasonal public program sponsor, Hyde Park Moldings. Our guest lecturer this evening, Barry Bergdoll, is a professor of art history at Columbia University and curator in the Department of Architecture and Design at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, where from 2007 to 2013, he served as the Philip Johnson Chief Curator of Architecture and Design. He's a specialist in 18th and 19th century French and German architecture and the author of numerous works on the period, including the textbook European Architecture 1750 to 1890 in the Oxford History of Art series. He's also author of the introduction to the recent ICAA publication, The Complete Works of Percier and Fontaine, published in partnership with Princeton Architectural Press. Without any further ado, I will turn control of this microphone over to Professor Barry Bergdoll.
Great, thank you, Adrian. And it's great to be back, although I'm in exactly the same space at home with a stormy outdoors, which I guess is appropriate for not only the time I want to talk to you about, but the time that we're living in. Time of upheaval. I thought topic was not only incredibly timely, as I hope you'll hear over and over again in the course of my remarks, but also one that I think made a natural segue from the talk a couple of weeks ago on Jean-Jacques Le Queux. It's going to be a much more informal talk than the last one. I'm trying to leave enough time at the end for a handful of questions. I know everybody gets Zoom fatigue, but nonetheless, there's a lot of exciting things that are going to happen in the decade that we're going to look at. I don't propose to offer for you a summary history of the French Revolution. Anyone who's a specialist in that period or even has more than a superficial knowledge might be a little bit offended that I'm going to talk about the revolutionary decade in general, rather than breaking down the incredibly complex history of moves not only from one year to the next, but in fact, political shifts often from one week to the next, although they will come in from time to time. There's a very good calendar of the French Revolution on Wikipedia, if anybody wants to try to put this into a finer grained chronological time. More, I'm concerned with what actually changed in architecture. Architecture as a practice, the very conception of architecture, and of course for this particular audience, attitudes towards the classical language of architecture that had been so thoroughly ingrained in French consciousness through the academic system of training and through royal support for classical architecture, so that we could say that classicism had become something of an architecture of state already in the various reigns of the Bourbon kings from the 17th into the 18th century. There's some of the questions that I want to look at with you tonight. We won't identify this view of another crowd. It's going to reappear in the course of my remarks, but I want to take you through some of these themes. Now, sometimes when one hears revolutionary architecture, we think almost immediately of that famous trio that I talked about last time. In fact, I tried to, excuse the pun given the view of the Bastille on the screen, that the trio that I tried to demolish in our considerations of the architectural fantasies of Jean-Jacques Le Queux. This was the trio that Emil Kaufmann famously in the 1950s referred to as three revolutionary architects, although most of their practice took place either before or after the final decade of the 18th century. And in fact, none of them was ever to have an official commission of any sort during the period in question. So that we, in a certain sense, pushed to the side time, this distinction between what came to be the art historical notion of revolutionary architecture that dealt with a radical conception of form, a willingness to strip away convention, tradition, and to rethink architecture in relationship to pure geometries, but also pure experience. I'm thinking here, of course, of the famous image in the lower left, Etienne Louis Boulet's proposal for a monument to Newton, where he proposed, in fact, to create an image of the cosmos for Newton to inhabit as simultaneously a memorial and a cenotaph, a grave without a body. But it was also a machine for creating emotions, a kind of forerunner of the planetarium, a space one could enter into and have no tactile relationship to the interior, so that one would feel the sublimity of the immense, unknowable, unbounded universe. So the extraordinary thing of creating a perfect sphere of bounded space in order to create a machine for feeling infinity. And on the right, one of the drawings that we looked at last time, and which is currently on view, but shuttered, of course, at the Morgan Library, Jean-Jacques Lequeux's drawing, this one, in fact, dating to the revolutionary period, his project for a gateway symbolizing the archway of the people. Now, this is a complex iconography. We could get into it, but I bring these in to show you that this extraordinary period of rethinking architecture that we call in art historical terms revolutionary architecture is actually the architecture of the Ancien Régime, figures who primarily worked under the royalty and had a complex relationship with the evolution of political events in the 1790s. In fact, the verso of this sheet by Lequeux has written on it, drawing that I did to save myself from the guillotine. To linger for just a moment, and who wouldn't want to with these absolutely spectacular drawings, this legacy of so-called revolutionary architecture, of an architecture that explored forms without any tradition in history, was nonetheless to provide an extraordinary legacy to the French Revolution and to everything that I want to talk about architectural thinking in this tumultuous period between 1789 and 1799, that is to say, between the fall of the Bastille and the coup d'etat of Napoleon. This is, of course, another set of drawings, two views of related monuments for funerary purposes by Boulet, but they are both meant to explore the capacity of architecture, even in its most primal form, here a very low-slung pyramid, to bodily emotions, to communicate sensations, as it would be said in 18th century thinking, to create architecture in which the architect can become not only the stage master of lighting, of form, but of emotions, the way that one feels. So this intense notion that architecture was related to human emotions and the possibility even of forming them, manipulating them even, if you will, was the legacy of these experimental graphic designs of the 1780s that would take on completely new significance with the political revolution after July 1789. Coupled with that was an architecture that also hoped to change people's perceptions, not simply for emotional effect, or not simply that they might identify with the program of a particular building, but also that they might, and this is the first of a set of themes that will be very contemporary feeling for us, that they might in fact improve people. This is a drawing that comes from the 1780s by an architect not terribly well known today, Bernard Pouillet, who's proposing an ideal hospital. It could be the subject of an entire lecture, but it reminds us of what I and others have called the discourse on institutions, but most importantly, the belief that disposing people in a particular mathematical way in space, this we might say is almost the origins of social distancing, getting hospital beds far enough apart from one another, separating into different wards people with different maladies, and having a building that was perfectly ventilated by its very architectural design, to such an extent that in the 1780s, people began to say, if you design a hospital perfectly enough, it can be a machine for healing or for curing. One theorist said on the eve of the French Revolution about this whole debate and all of these experiments, he said, anytime that we bring people together in a group, we alter their ways of being, their morals. Anytime that we bring them together in an enclosed space, we alter at once their morals and their health. So what could be a more appropriate reflection from the philosopher, pragmatic philosopher Cavigny, than this notion of the relationship of space to behavior? So that rather than give you a political history of the French Revolution, what I want to do in probably many too many slides is to look at it in relationship to architecture, not so much in relationship to style, but into this relationship to themes that architecture might be an active participant in the shifting terrain of the revolutionary project, if we can even use that in the singular. Now, many years ago, at the time of the bicentennial of the French Revolution, I was involved as the curator of an exhibition in Paris and Montreal. You're going to hear some of the research from that body of work that led to an exhibition on the French Pantheon. You'll know that we're about third way through the lecture when we get to the Pantheon. And I bought a 1-volume paperback dictionary of the French Revolution. And as soon as I unwrapped it at home, I immediately opened to the entry on architecture, which had said simply, one knows that in a period of upheaval and war are not the economic means to produce architecture. Therefore, according to this dictionary, architecture was a non-topic of the French Revolution. I want to argue precisely the opposite. Even if very little was built by the state as it created entirely new institutions for governing and new concepts of the citizen, architecture itself was fundamentally changed. And in fact, as we'll see at the very end, an enormous amount was actually built in Paris and in other French cities, even in the countryside in the 1790s, because it was a period of economic upheaval as well. In the day when the Dow Jones collapsed, you might wonder, is my money better placed in buildings or in terrain or in real estate? These were, of course, questions of the economic upheavals of the 1790s. And we're going to end by seeing the real estate implications of the revolution. So here, of course, an image made relatively soon after the event by the painter Rouelle of the storming of the Bastille on the 14th of July, 1789. As every school child knows, there weren't actually that many prisoners in there. It was more of a symbolic event of attacking feudalism, embodied here in the architectural form of a castellated prison at what had been the city wall of Paris. So it was also a breaking open of the city as a defined space. And only a few prisoners were sprung from that prison, but in fact, the Bastille became automatically an actor in the revolution in many ways, symbolic and architectural. And I'm juxtaposing it, of course, with the attempts to put forth completely new concepts, this idea of undividable unity of the French Republic. This is just a little bit later with the Declaration of the Republic in 1792, but already in 1789, these three key concepts combined with the new flag that replaces the royal white flag, the red, white, and blue, of liberty, equality, and fraternity. But along with it, a slogan, one could imagine this being paraded even in the streets right now: liberty, equality, fraternity, or death. And as you can see, the figures on either side are clothed in completely novel clothing for the period. Indeed, the French Revolution, in a sense, wanted to reinvent everything. At the same time as it believed that it was grounding things on a natural law of the relationship of people one to another and the capacity of people to govern themselves, the questioning of all of the inheritance of royalty, of aristocracy, the three estates that made up French society, of a lack of equality before the law, which is one of the first things decreed within weeks of the storming of the Bastille. But I just brought together a few images to show the extent to which very rapidly the revolution wanted to change life in every way. And along with it, of course, architecture and space. Beginning with this, in the name of the law, it is not allowed to walk around without wearing the cocarde, which is a symbol that one adheres to the new truths, and to employ no other use, naming of people than citoyen. So everyone is no longer a subject of Louis XVI. Everyone is a citizen, neither a vassal of a feudal lord nor a subject of a king, but everyone is to be equally a citizen. So this creation of both the word and the concept of citizen, along with it very rapidly an attempt to abolish the formal U form from the French language. So language was going to change both on the page and in the daily relationship of people one to another, as would their outward address, the way that they would present themselves in public. This extended even to the way people groomed themselves, hairstyling, not the quarantine long shaggy hair, but a Republican hair appearance, or this revival that the painter Jacques-Louis David proposed for the members of the National Assembly to wear a modified ancient Roman toga. He did a whole series of these drawings. This was actually in the Metropolitan Museum, of how the legislatures, those who would represent this completely new idea of representative government rather than royal administration, how they should dress. And on the right were buttons that one could sew onto your clothing that would show where you stood in the political spectrum. So also the beginning of the campaign button, but the declaration of identity through dress. So language and dress, but not just language and dress. We could even go to the extent to say that the French Revolution had the ambitions to completely change everyday relationships to time and space. Famously, after the declaration of the Republic in 1792, it was proposed to create a new calendar, to get rid of the calendar that went back to the Romans, and to propose instead a rationalized system of time based on not only on the seasons, but based on a system of 10 months. The week would be abolished and replaced by the décade, the 10-day period, with a day of rest on the 11th, and then a new 10-day period to begin. An attempt actually, and therefore to use mathematics to override tradition. The calendar beginning to renumber time with the year 1 in 1793. So 1793, year 1 of the Republic, a completely new reordering of time, a new era had begun. Of course, possibly because it was necessary to wait 10 days to rest rather than 6, this system fell by the wayside after a number of years. And one even finds in documents that if people are resisting to use it by putting both the old dates and the new dates on top of many letters. On the right, a map of France such as you've never seen, probably. Interesting to realize that in the 1790s is the first commercial printing of graph paper. And here is an attempt to take the topography of France, its rather jagged contours of seashore, and impose on it a grid to create a whole new set of administrative units, the French départements or departments, which exist to this day, which were to replace the ancient provinces. So you would no longer be a subject of the king and living in the province of Provence, but rather you would be a citizen living in perhaps the department of the Bouches du Rhône, of the mouth of the Rhône River. So named after topography, all sorts of traditions to be changed, not only language, but time and space itself. Of course, France didn't conform very well to the graph paper of the perfect grid that the engineers were using in the École Polytechnique to map space. So in the end, this system too didn't quite go into effect with the geometric clarity of this proposal that I'm showing you. But even your local street corner would change. If you are able to travel again and you go to Bordeaux, you will find that many street corners have deliberately kept some of the changes of the names. You see how many times this place was changed from the Rue du Palais Royal, the street of the Royal Palace, to the street of the department, this new administrative, to the street of the prefecture, which is, of course, the administrative headquarters of the department. It is today the street of the Hôtel de Ville, or the City Hall. So this renaming, changing of space, changing of uniforms, of language, an attempt to reform time, and of course, even the way everything was measured with the invention postulated already some years later, but finally adopted at the very end of this period, of the metric system to measure distance and weight. And there you see the official meter on a public building, so that you could actually go and refer to a perfect standard meter in public space. I couldn't resist this quote from Salvador Dali, who sees something of the surrealism in this rationalism when he said, God invented man and man invented the metric system. But this, of all of the proposals to change measure, was the one that would remain in effect. But what about architecture? Let's go back to the Bastille, this day of the 14th of July, which is going to be celebrated ever since 1830 as the French national holiday, although the revolution was obviously a process that had begun sometime before with the calling of the Estates General to Versailles, but it was the storming of the Bastille that almost overnight was taken over as a symbol of a beginning of this new revolutionary time. Although in the end, the calendar would start with the Republic, not with the Prise de la Bastille. But what to do with this Bastille? This was a hefty argument throughout the day on the 14th, probably more significant for the debates over what to do with this symbol of feudalism, this huge, underused ancient bastion, part of the fortifications of late medieval Paris, and now a rather ineffective and not terribly used prison. Some wanted to keep it as a memory of the past, but also a memory of the event that had happened some hours before. Others wanted to demolish it because the act of dismantling it itself would, for them, be an act of dismantling the old order. But what would replace the old order if it were dismantled? Here you see the sans-culottes, the revolutionary citizens with their cocards, with their new forms of dress to identify themselves, beginning to pick away at this building. By 2 days after the 14th of July, on the 16th of July, 1789, this man, a building contractor, Pierre-François Palois, was able to get the building contract for taking the Bastille down, and he was going to accept partially in payment to actually have the building materials of it. Some of the building materials he sold back to the state. They used it to complete the construction of the bridge at the Pont de la Concorde. So some of them are perhaps still in there today in the core of the bridge piers, but some of the finer stones he proposed actually to put on the market. So we see that immediately the French Revolution is not simply a political revolution, but an economic one in which this type of building contractor is also, which in French is an entrepreneur, but he's also an entrepreneur in the English sense, because many of them he carved into models of the building. Here's one that survives in the Musée Carnavalet in Paris. And they were sold as souvenirs to those who wanted to purchase them, to have a very heavy souvenir, long before those little bronze Eiffel Towers. But he also sent as a gift one to each of the new departmental halls, the prefectures. Each of the 89 newly created prefectures was to receive one of these types of almost secular civic relics. What about the space left behind? Now, in reality, this had been a debate underway for a long time. Too often forgotten that under Louis XVI, the idea of demolishing the Bastille and opening up the city of Paris, since the suburbs outside the gate here had long been a thriving area, particularly of furniture production. This is why there were so many workers in the area to attack the Bastille. And there had even been proposals that in the place of the Bastille, a royal square to house the statue of Louis XVI might be placed. This continued to be discussed even after July 1789, because let us not forget that the king remained the king until 1792, when finally he was arrested and ultimately put to the guillotine in January 1793. So we had a very mixed system of an exploration of a legislative assembly, but the remainder of the monarchy between 1789 and 1791 into 1792. But what ultimately did happen on that place took many years to take form, but here's a revolutionary counter-proposal in which a garden would be laid out, leading from the Bastille towards the Seine. So north is up here on the left, and this is pretty much the line of today's Boulevard Henri IV. But one of the most fascinating things about these topiary gardens, I think you can see, is that this maze was going to be in the form of the plan of the Bastille. So overnight, the Bastille prison is being turned into a symbol of its opposite. This interests me enormously, the idea of taking something, an almost act of linguistic reversal, making it mean the opposite. So the Bastille is no longer a symbol of oppression, of royal rule, of what we might call imposition, but rather is going to be replaced and to enter so much into revolutionary iconography that here on the right, in this proposal of allegorical embodiment of the French Republic as a seated woman being served by equality, égalité, which you see is a architect's triangle, and by liberty. What is the symbol of liberty? Liberty, like some Christian saint, carries the relic, the object of her passion, and this is the Bastille itself. So liberty carries a little Bastille, which has become the symbol of liberty, one of the three founding principles of this moment. Today, if you go to look for the Bastille, there are signs all over the place of where it was, so you can relate the map of Paris today to the location of it. It's partly traced on the sidewalk of the Place de la Bastille, and you can even find elements of it that were never removed by the industrious Palois here on the subway platform, the metro platform at the station Bastille. So this kind of linguistic reversal, now I want to take it right into the institutions of the new state, the transformation of the calling of the Estates General, something that the king had called from time to time, where the three estates, the aristocracy, the church, and the population, the people, would come together, the people being the third estate, would come together to discuss matters, largely matters of taxation, complaints. Famously, one had been called in Versailles, where the crown had been now for over a century, and they met there, the opening on the 5th of May, 1789. They met in a room called the Menu Plaisir, as you see in my caption, in the Salle des Menus Plaisir. This was an area in the city of Versailles, designed by the wonderful classical architect Historian Paris, to serve as the fabricating place for all of the decors that were needed for the festivities of the king. So the king's birthday, fireworks, royal marriages, any kinds of festivities. These were the menu plaisir of the king. So this was a kind of warehouse space that was given this temporary decor by the person who staged these type of ceremonies. So this is these are not stone columns, this is a kind of decor for the meeting of the menu plaisir. As you know, there was an enormous and complex debate over the course of the months of May and June about how voting would take place. Would it take place by a state, or would it take place by the number of individuals? So here we have the question of whether the tradition that the vast population represented only one vote of 3, or whether some other form would take place, ultimately leading to the famous pulling away of the third estate and their meeting in this jeu de paume, a kind of squash court, really. It's often called the oath of the tennis court, but the game was more like squash, taking place indoors. This is a famous sketch by the painter David, who becomes something of the history painter to the revolution, for a mural that was to be intended for the Legislative Assembly of the taking of the oath of the third estate. This was, of course, the oath where they said that on the 20th of June, 1789, that they vowed not to separate and not to reassemble wherever circumstances require until the Constitution of the Kingdom. Calling themselves the National Assembly, drawing considerably, interestingly, from the language of the United States Declaration of Independence and even our own Constitution, so much in peril right now. This formed the language of their sermon, and that ultimately went back to the creation of the Legislative Assembly. Of course, famously in August, the Declaration of the Rights of the Citizen and of Mankind were to be declared. So here, this assembly of notables is transformed overnight with the writing of a constitution and the creation of a legislative assembly, and along with it, the recognition of the equality of all citoyens before the law. So here, the Declaration of the Rights of Man that were adopted. And then what interests us as our subject, here is the plan of the room that was created, the great basilican room that you just saw by Paris, for the three estates, the notables, the clergy facing one another, then back here, the peuple, with the possibility for the king to visit this and to come down a central aisle and sit on a throne at the head of the room. You saw that in this view there. So that's that layout that Paris created for the three estates, thinking how to lay them out. Clearly the best seats were on either side of almost the choir for the clergy and the aristocrats. This was all to be redrawn for the Legislative Assembly, so this radical reworking of existing space. And this is a theme we're going to see for the rest of my slides. Very rare, the possibility of the revolution, as I put in my title, to project the future by creating a kind of Boulay or Ledoux like brand new building, unprecedented form. Rather, for the most part, the revolution was going to be a process of radical editing of the received, partly because of pressing time, but also limitations of means. And so here this space was transformed without changing any walls simply by reordering all of the seating, in which everyone was placed in a vast kind of Roman racetrack double amphitheater around a central speaking area there. So this declaration of space, of the abolition of the three orders and the creation of all citizens equal before the law. And so here we see the space as it was for the three estates. Now the inspiration from this was itself not only the ancient theater, but also the adaptation of the Greek form of the theater here in a kind of neo-Roman interpretation that had been pioneered in the 1770s in a number of public buildings, most famously this room that you see on the right by the architect Gondouin, which was the lecture hall and the dissection chamber of the School of Surgery, still standing, still a wonderful room to visit. Here is the School of Surgery, today called the École de Médecine, in the street of the same name in the 6th arrondissement of Paris, today part of the university. You can see that moving through that triumphal arch here to a temple front, we'll see in a moment, and behind stood the dissection chamber. And in order that every student would have an uninterrupted view, the steep ranking of this meant that no head would get in front of another head, and everyone would have an equal view of the lessons of the dissection of that cadaver and then into the room. So under the French Revolution, this idea, the perfect amphitheater, the perfect place for equal viewing, becomes the form of legislative assembly. And it would be continued throughout the decade and into the early 19th century. Here, the seating of the convention at the Tuileries, although as you can see, it didn't automatically always bring peace to the proceedings. And even in this, the planning in those same years of Washington, D.C., although the U.S. Declaration of Independence and obviously Constitution predated the French Revolution, the laying out of Washington, D.C. as a national capital happens in exact parallel with the revolutionary decade in Paris. So we see here this seating for the Senate, not today the most peaceful assembly either, in taking over that form into U.S. Assembly, and then ultimately into the Chamber of Deputies as it exists to this day, the lower house of the French bicameral legislature. Now, we could also take that form over. I think you can see that this form here that Paris is proposing for the Salle des Menus Plaisirs, for the Legislative Assembly, was also adopted almost immediately for the celebration of the first of many revolutionary festivals. This was the Festival of Federation, the Fête de la Fédération, that was celebrated on the 14th of July, 1790, marking the first anniversary of the taking of the Bastille. This was all laid out by the architect Sellerier. And interestingly, again, for this reversal, this editing, now not only an editing of a building, but an editing of urban space, we are on the Champ de Mars, the military marching and practice field in front of the military school. This is the École Militaire, the great building by Gabriel. This is the Champ de Mars, which of course still exists. And it was transformed for this occasion with the creation of these enormous bleachers, creating a perfect kind of Roman race course or stadium around a central altar of the country, altar of the fatherland. And the participants would enter through this triumphal arch with 3 equal arches. So all citizens equal, the 3 estates entering, and all of them seeing not only what happened on the altar of the fatherland, whatever new civic ritual was being prepared for this somewhere between a political rally and an outdoor Catholic mass, but also the spectacle of all of the people themselves assembled. Something, of course, we long for in a way. We've seen it in protest march in the last week, although here the people created into a kind of figure of the amphitheater. Here is Sellerier showing his project. See how the people will filter in, but what I love here is the angel of fame delivering the plan. The plan is what is going to generate not only the event, but the types of new relationships, political beliefs, and what they hope can become the basis of the new political organization in society. There's another view of the arch, and this is actually Lafayette performing on the altar of the fatherland. So still a mixture here of religious and secular symbols. We could track, and many historians have done this, most famously the wonderful historian of the French Revolution, Mona Ozouf, the evolution of the French Revolution through its festivals, which become more and more radical. Here, the idea of Robespierre to replace the mysteries, he would say, the superstitions of Christian religion by a new secular religion, the cult of the Supreme Being, trying it out, trying to get it going through the festival, the cult of the Supreme Being, here on the exact same place. So this place is redesigned, reorganized, restaged, re-architectured, if you will, every couple of months for a different festival. But also the processions and the way one arrived at that space began to edit and create new meanings of relationships between monument spaces and public outdoor spaces in the city of Paris, as the map of Paris was given new revolutionary readings. Or other views here of the staging of the festival of the Supreme Being. One might note this importance of the singular tree there. It's going to recur over and over again. It's an element that goes back to Rousseau, whose ideas were very much promulgated as the underpinnings of this revolutionary cult of the Supreme Being. That takes us actually to these philosophers. It was they who would be involved in one of the most extraordinary re-editings of the French Revolutionary decade. And this was the decision taken in April of 1791 to transform the still unconsecrated Church of Saint Geneviève. You see it here in two views. We're going to see it many times for the next few minutes in different guises. This was a church that you probably all know was famously commissioned from the architect Soufflot by Louis XV to be the Church of the Nation, dedicated to the patron saint of Paris, Saint Geneviève. So it was a royal foundation, not a parish church, not a monastery church, although it replaced the monastery church of Saint Geneviève in the monastery that stands just behind it. It was to be a kind of new alliance between crown and church, between the first and second estate, if you will. But it was decided in 1791 that this church, which had never been consecrated, the construction period lasted long past Soufflot's own death in 1781. The dome was still not completed in 1789. The building needed to be completed, but why would one build a church at a moment when the church was in the process of being abolished as a place of privilege and oppression, being rethought in very radical, in the end not lasting ways? It was decided to create a new institution and to rename the building the French Pantheon, and to have it be a place for the burial of civic heroes. So in place of saints and of God would be the creation of the idea of a civic hero. Westminster Abbey was one of the inspirations, although there in the English system, the Parliament and the King coincided, just as the idea of the church and secular heroes were both accommodated in Westminster Abbey. But the French were in a very, if you will, bipartisan, which is to say oppositional state of mind, and this was to become a great civic monument. So how could you take a building that had the aspirations to be the finest, the grandest church ever built in France, one that would revive the idea of a monumental antique temple front and combine it with the dome of St. Peter's to create the ultimate Christian French symbol? How would you turn that into something completely different that would no longer mean God and throne, but would mean civic values embodied in the idea of un grand homme, or a great man? This, of course, great women do not come until 20th century discussions on this very issue. What you see here is the relationship of that transformation of meaning to festivals. On the left, the translation of the remains of Voltaire to bury him in the crypt of great men in the new French Pantheon, and on the right, in 1794, 3 years later, the bringing of the remains of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. They were the only people who were going to be admitted into the Pantheon whose had died before the revolution. Otherwise, all heroes would come after the year one. So we'll turn to these in a minute. The invention of the idea of pantheonization and the animation of public space, indeed even ultimately the transformation of public space to create the stage for not the altar, but for the pantheonization of people of ideas who were the bedrock of the writing of the first French Constitution by 1792. Building so charged with royal symbolism. Here is Louis XV laying the cornerstone in front of a full-scale billboard of the future temple in 1764. It could go into the whole evolution of the church, which became more and more complex, dominating the skyline. The idea of the dome as a kind of tempietto that marked the place where the relics of Saint Geneviève were buried deep in the crypt. That's the reason this building had a crypt. The photograph here, you see it after its transformation into the Pantheon. It's important for us to notice one thing, which is wanting to unite an entire interior of freestanding columns carrying vaults. He thought of this as a unity of classical and Gothic architecture. More on that in a moment. With a piercing of the envelope of this, of the exterior walls, by very large-scale windows, so that this interiorized peristyle or columns would play against an incredible kaleidoscopic theater of daylight effects as the sun toured the building on the highest place on the left bank of Paris. Here's the project as it existed in 1764. It would develop very quickly from 2 domes to 3 domes, marking here the descent into a crypt where the relics of Saint Geneviève and ultimately the monks of the Abbey of Saint Geneviève were to be buried. And there you can see this absolutely thin envelope of masonry around the building, flooding the building with light. So that was the aesthetic of Soufflot's building. He wanted the impossibility of carrying a very heavy dome on columns. This is not ultimately Gothic buttressing, was to help him create some of that impossible synthesis. This is not a lesson in the architecture of Soufflot, tempted as I am, but rather in the inheritance of this by the revolution. It was a sculptor, Quatremer de Quincy, and an art theorist who was charged with trying to conceptualize how to transform the building into the Pantheon. The major thing that he would do, besides changing all of the sculptural adornments and the decorations and lobbing off the cross and proposing to replace it with a monumental allegorical figure of fame trumpeting the revolution on the top of the dome, was to close all of the windows, because he thought that all of the light in the building did not lend itself to the type of reflective atmosphere for a new ritual of taking young children to this building that they might think about model citizens that they themselves would want to emulate. To this day, you can see where all of the windows of the church were filled in to change the character, the experience, the emotions, the lighting effects of the building. Some of the murals of the late 19th century that took the place of those windows. But most importantly, this building lent itself to this new ritual because it had a crypt. So the idea would be to create this pantheon of great men who would be buried in the crypt, and then to create a kind of memorial space, a Westminster Abbey of sculpture, so that the iconography of their life and the place of remembering their death would be juxtaposed but not joined. Once again, this attempt to keep things in opposition. Here is one of the great frenemies of all times. This is pre-Facebook, but Voltaire and Rousseau, who not only had opposing philosophies, but in fact scarcely spoke with one another, here walking to some kind of idealized vision of the Pantheon, past some children, probably newly escaped from Rousseau's Émile, being led by the figure of eternal fame. Look at their 2 ceremonies, you would think that they were in different cities. Voltaire is arriving in a vision of a kind of civic Rome, under a tumultuous sky. Rousseau comes in the city that looks more like what it did look like, and he brings with him, of course, a piece of nature, a tree. We'll see where that came from. There is the staging designed by the architect Sellerier, the same architect who had designed the Fête de la Fédération, the first festival, designed this huge 3-story chariot to take the mortal remains of Voltaire and to bury him in the Pantheon. See it garlanded, actually taking up some of the motifs of Soufflot's building into a piece of parade apparatus. Here you see all of the order for the assembly being laid up for this ceremony. Serrier's drawing, very much in the style of 2 young men who were revolutionizing taste at that point, Mercier and Fontaine. I'm not giving prominence this evening because we had a lecture about a year ago on Percier and Fontaine, and that's online if you want to look. And here, ultimately, the final resting place of Voltaire with these classical motifs of the garlands and the faces of tragedy, because he was, after all, a playwright as well. But he declared the rights of man against the servitude of feudalism. So Voltaire, as a foundation stone of the philosophy of the revolution. Rousseau was already buried at Ermenonville in one of the great English-style landscape gardens, of course being associated with ideas of freedom, nature left free rather than contorted to the absolute, let's say, axes of Versailles. So Rousseau had to be brought from Ermenonville, from that great garden. His remains were first laid to rest or unrest for overnight in this wonderful little primitive temple in the Tuileries Gardens. A big debate, should he remain in the Tuileries? He was a man of nature. Shouldn't he be in a garden? Here's a proposal by an architect to create a ring of poplar trees as an ornament on an island to bring Ermenonville into the Tuileries, which after all was the first public park in France. Louis XVI had already opened it up to the public in 1782. But in the end, Rousseau was taken, whether he wanted it or not, with one tree that he got to bring from Ermenonville to the Pantheon and buried axially across the central aisle of the crypt in a kind of vision of the primitive hut of Loger becoming the temple of Soufflot with the eternal flame of his ideas. So there you see that. But what about that dome, which symbolized God, the presence of religion on the skyline of Paris, but moreover, which was developing very threatening cracks in the four main pillars? There was fear that these men who were being placed in a burial place to be admired for eternity find themselves in the midst of an undesired ruin. So countless projects, this one of my favorite by the architect Charles de Vailly, a way to transform the Pantheon, both to solve the problem of getting rid of the symbolism of the dome, so associated with St. Peter's or St. Paul's in London, and at the same time to solve that by buttressing it up. Here, a proposal to actually build 4 buttresses and make it appear as though a pyramid, this ancient symbol of stability, had merged with the complex forms of the Roman temple front, the Greek cross plan, and now the remaining ring of columns like an ancient thalos, crowned with statues of great civic heroes, but most fascinatingly, using the corners of the pyramid to create staircases so that the public could climb up and stand there and look at the panorama of Paris, seen, staged with the foreground of great civic heroes. So complete transformation of the panoramic experience of Paris from this new viewing stage. There's one more view of a way to create obelisks as buttresses for the place where there were weak structural problems you can see here at the crossing of the dome. This was a period of incredible artistic and architectural change. One of the most important things that happened was the abolition of the academies, of the Academy of Architecture, of the Academy of Painting and Sculpture, of the Academy of Music. At the same time, declaration that there was no monopoly on the title of the architect that could only be recognized by the Academy, but anybody who bought what were called letters of patent could call themselves an architect for a simple financial transaction. So a complete throwing open of the marketplace of architecture. Lots of new organizations begin, organizations of friendly organizations, attempts of friends to create new schools, new studios, new professional organizations. This is a group of friends, including Percier and Fontaine, who are going to become major form givers and later to become Napoleon's architects, in the studio that they themselves had decorated for the painter Isabey in a style which we call the Empire style, but which in fact was more or less fully formed even before Napoleon became the head council in 1799. This painting is 1798 of a decor that's probably a year or two earlier. And the salon was thrown open to a much wider group of people. Of this new culture of display, of this accessibility of a salon without a jury, a salon as a kind of free assembly of images, but also of the possibility of making a reputation as an artist, an extraordinary event was staged and displayed here. And this were the results, 2 things. the results, first of all, of a hiring of artists and architects to reconceptualize Paris. This is his famous Plan des Artistes, or the plan of artists, of all the things that needed to happen to make Paris a modern, functioning city, including uniting the two islands into a more efficient flow in the Seine. We could spend hours on this, but the idea of a complete reform of urban space, and this, of course, was based on an earlier exercise from the 1760s. So over and over again, in fact, these key elements have roots in the Enlightenment, but also the reconceptualization of the Palace of the Louvre, where Louis XIV had abandoned, Louis XV, Louis XVI no longer resided there, into a universal museum in which to bring together all of the things that had been declared public property, works of art, works of scientific instruments, literary manuscripts, and the like, that were going to become biens nationaux, or national property, as opposed to the collections of aristocrats or the church. The taking over by the state of the collections abandoned by aristocrats who had gone into exile, mostly in Britain, or the abolition of the monasteries, and then briefly the abolition of the church, of all of the works of art that were held there. The idea that the Louvre might be no longer a palace, but a universal museum, an idea too which had already been put forth under Louis XVI, but now provided a source of imagination for architects, including here de Vailly, imagining how to restyle the building. But most importantly were the hundreds of drawings and projects that were created for, directly, or around the competitions of the year 2, that is to say 1794, when the state decided to create a kind of forerunner of the WPA, ideas competitions, ultimately with prizes and prize money for painters, sculptors, and architects, all of whom were to be charged with projecting the future iconography, but also the future buildings, the future public functions of the Republic. A completely new society for which a completely new architecture could be prepared in graphic form, in drawings, in preparation for a time when there was enough political settlement and also economic settlement to undertake such things. Here's a project for honoring the armies, reminding us that by now the revolution is also at war, trying to spread the revolution across the borders of France, but also to protect the revolution from foreign monarchs who might want to suppress it. Here's one by the architect Antoine Vaunier for the head of the Champs-Élysées. But the competitions of the year 2 was a veritable reflection on all the new building types. The idea that we have today of buildings being organized by type, by function, that a palace of justice looks like one thing. This is a local tribunal, a lower court, in which actually the architecture will be made up not only of baseless Doric columns that always represent solidity and the beginning of rebuilding and fundamental truths, but also the engraving of the Constitution itself, of the law, the written law, as the foundation of a republic, and of course combined with our friend, the semicircular theater. So this is one by the architect Doron and along with Thibault, a temple of equality, even imagining a new order in which the precepts of the revolution would be inscribed in words, but the orders would be reduced to a fundamental primitivism. So the evolution of this kind of classical primitivism, combining the heroism but the return to basic principles of the French Revolution in everything from social organization to the laying of masonry and to the creation of a neoclassicism, of a revolutionary coinage, if you will. So as you can see with this inscription, the virtues of the people are the strongest sustainers or fundaments of equality. Here, Percier-Fontaine imagining a monument to those who died defending the fatherland, and many, many others. A national singing academy. Here, a thing for the Legislative Assembly, of course. Revolutionary Assembly, Legislative Assembly, Democratic Assembly, all are to be among the prime motifs. And here, a project, not for the competition of the year 2, but right around the same time, for restructuring the center of Lille, at the almost northeast border of France and Flanders, around a legislative building, almost proto-Art Deco in a way. And also whole new ideas. This is an idea for a public posting, for placing laws and notices, that there should be one at every important crossroads, and it takes its name from a description in ancient Greek literature of such things that existed on the streets of democratic Athens. So let me just show you two more aspects of this revolutionary decade, which, in spite of the declaration of that encyclopedia that I bought in 1989, and I keep mostly for the foolhardiness of its claim that nothing important happened architecturally. One, I want to look at the evolution of the modern public museum and its relationship to patriotism and national identity emerging from the French Revolution, and also from, very timely here, I want to talk about the coinage of the word vandalism to mean the attacking of cultural symbols and their demolition. This is the School of Medicine that we looked at earlier, but here across from it, the demolition of the monastery of the Cordeliers, one of the abolished monasteries being demolished, important medieval monument being demolished in order to create a public square for proper viewing of this public building of the School of Medicine. But so this was a decade of extraordinary demolitions, of extraordinary destructions, often undertaken not necessarily because of a problem with the building, or even as in this case, to create more open public space, but for symbolic violence to cultural artifacts. This is the prelude for what we're going to see, which is the creation here in what is today the quarters of the École des Beaux-Arts, the old monastery of the Petits Augustins on the left bank. The Louvre is just over here, right off of our screen. There's the end of the Île de la Cité. This is a map of the 19th century, but this is the location of a very important monastery of the Petits Augustins. Here we see the plan of it, and it was given to a kind of impresario, sculptor, sometime theater stage designer, Alexandre Lenoir, as a warehouse for receiving all of the art properties, we might call them, that were taken, confiscated from emigre aristocrats from their chateau or from their hôtel and from churches, and to bring them together. And there he would bring them together in this juxtaposition that I love of two portraits of Lenoir. Here is Lenoir at the Royal Abbey of Saint-Denis to the north of Paris, the place of royal burials, if you will, what is being replaced by the Pantheon in revolutionary terms. And he is trying to convince the revolutionary sans-culottes that these are not symbols of oppression, but great works of French art. That these do not belong to the monarch who is buried under here, I think this is Anne of Austria, but rather they belong to the nation as a whole. That they are, in fact, the work of French genius. He is inventing the history of art to define these as artistic values that represent French genius and the rise of French history, French nationhood, French consciousness, to be understood as a past that leads to the present rather than as symbols of an oppression to be overturned. And here he is with some of the objects that he has saved, which he wants to put on display in his museum. Tony Vidler, wonderful historian of the late 18th century French architecture and many other topics, long ago observed the coining of new words in the French Revolution. There were many, many. We've already seen the insistence on citoyen and others, but two that go together here. The coining of the term vandalisme or vandalism to mean the cultural defacing of things, and along with it, the idea of conservateur or curator, the person who protects works of art and ultimately puts them in a display. So here we have what might be argued to be the two earliest museums of architecture. The Museum of French Monuments, in which Alexandre Lenoir took it upon himself to organize the various artifacts that were warehoused in this former monastery and to use the architecture as a theatrical setting of the evolution of French history by century through its artistic production. So a chronological display of French genius in the arts rather than organized by centuries, rather than by the reigns of monarchs. And below, nearby, a commercial attempt to create a historical gallery of architecture through models and panoramic paintings by the painter Louis-François Casas. These are some of the watercolors that Lenoir created to show the atmospheres that he'd created. So here returns that idea of atmosphere, but now atmosphere to create a sense of past time, of the ability to walk through one's own history and to share that history as a history, a museum of French monuments. This was, in a sense, a place not only for aesthetic experience, but to build the notion of being a French citizen. It would all spill out even into a garden where Lenoir staged many of the larger pieces in an area that he called Elysia, and creating even fictive heroes from fiction. This is the tomb of Abelard and Eloise, which was one of the most popular. Now, let me just conclude by debunking definitively the idea that nothing happens in a period of revolutionary change because of political turmoil, because of economic turmoil. Who wonders what might come out of the three upheavals that we are dealing with at the moment? The upheaval, of course, of health with COVID-19, the upheaval of the demand for a more equal society, racial equality, of an attempt to consciously deracinate this enracinated racial bias from which our country suffers so much, that we've seen in the protest marches of the last 2 weeks. And of course, today, economic tumult on the markets, but accompanied by millions of people unemployed. Some of these scenarios were also scenarios of the 1790s. But at the same time, the tumult brought with it the notion of where to put your money, how to invest, new forms, new liberties. So I just want to show you what has yet to be fully documented, the explosion of new building in Paris in the 1790s. As rampant inflation meant invest in stone, invest in masonry. And along with it, the freeing up of censorship, the ability to stage plays, the rise of a very vibrant commercial theater, new forms of urbanism. What I'm showing you on the screen is also an advertisement, since we're talking economy, for the next lecture I'm going to give to the Institute on the 15th of July on the German architects Schiele and Schinkel. These are sketches by the architect Friedrich Schiele on his visit to Paris in 1794, sketching not the Legislative Assembly, but of course one of the festivals that he saw on the Champ de Mars, but also the new styles of apartment buildings, the opening up of new streets, new urban forms in these very stripped down apartment buildings, such as here on the beginnings of the Rue de Rivoli, new inventions in skylights, all sorts of observations in his sketchbook. Perhaps this is our best known image of a street that exists today only in truncated form, the first fully arcaded street in Paris, in which the sidewalk, pioneered in the 1770s already in selective places, becomes a new place of public interchange, of public assembly, as well as of commercial activity, the beginning of what will become the shopping arcade in what was the Rue des Colonnes. The Rue des Colonnes was connected with its absolutely radical reduction to a kind of proto-primitive classicism, inspired by the discovery some decades earlier of Paestum and of the earliest Doric columns, but here that heroicism, as well as economic, fiscal wiseness of these very simple to create replicable forms of a rudimentary classicism with, we might say, almost revolutionary vigor. But all of this creation of new housing, apartments for the apartment market, but shops under the arcades, was connected to the main attraction, a new theater, the Théâtre Feydeau here. You can see, therefore, we might say, a vision of a kind of urbanism with dwelling, offices, workshops, shops, and an anchor tenant, if you will, the theater. This is, of course, the formula of Rockefeller Center. This is the formula of the suburban shopping mall, a attraction that brings people to a vibrant, multi-use, multifunctional city quarter. Early engravings of this work by Legrand and Molinos. They had formed a private school of architecture, extremely interesting architects trained under the Ancien regime, but who take advantage of all of the new opportunities of the revolutionary decade. They competed in the competitions of year two, something that actually led to no building whatsoever, but they more productively, both in terms of money that they earned, but also in terms of the legacy that they left, the very vibrant, by the middle of the 1790s, real estate market for new theaters, shops, apartments, even whole new streets, much of it laid out on the confiscated territory of not only of the monarchy, but of monasteries. In fact, this Théâtre Feydeau, there you see the interior, this wonderful kind of reduction of a earlier model, the Odéon Theater of the Ancien Régime, into a commercial theater. Here's the Rue des Colonnes with a side entrance and this connection of the circulation of the city to the circulation of the theater. But here we see this whole area, the so-called Feydeau Quarter, named after the theater. See the names referring to St. Thomas. This was a convent here that had been expropriated, demolished. The stock exchange would be built here, a new theater with apartment houses, shops, and this arcaded street, a real estate development that is taking advantage of the clearing up of very central land, just at the periphery of 18th century Paris. This is the Rue de Richelieu, and many of you probably know the stock exchange, and the Metro Bourse is right here. So the Rue des Colonnes is drawn by Gilly, and a photograph from the 19th century before it was fully truncated, and a detailing of this radical invention of completely new motifs based in the study of antiquity, but reduced now to a type of repetition of an almost abstracted revolutionary classicism. We might almost end there stylistically, because this is in fact the architecture of the revolution, even though it draws from many of the ideas promulgated by Boulay and Ledoux. But just a few to take us back to Boulay and Ledoux. Ledoux, imprisoned for a while during the French Revolution because of his connection with Louis XVI, with the tax barriers, with the salt tax, but here working for a private entrepreneur, a real estate developer, Hostin, who built an entirely new style of really garden apartments, inspired by what he saw in a trip to London, the great influence of the period that many of the emigres spent in London in the 1790s, here creating a series of shared apartment pavilions with gardens in between, up at just not that far from the Théâtre Feydeau. This, of course, was demolished before even the invention of photography. We don't have any photographs of it, but this radical, repetitive, modular architecture of Ledoux. Here are the plans of it with this wonderful shared garden space, partly for activities, partly for views of the garden. There's a whole urban proposal for a new conception of the multifamily dwelling in Paris. And the last, I would say, is the birth of the shopping arcade, the glazed arcade. These were in fact buildings, but many of them were built across vacant land, either the gardens of aristocratic mansions, hôtels particuliers, that had been expropriated or even put up for sale by their aristocratic owners, or across the lands of monasteries, and particularly on the right bank. And there you can see the cutting of one of the earliest, the passage of the panoramas. And of course, it had as its anchor tenant two panoramas. This is the multiplex cinema, Theater 1, Theater 2, showing two different panoramas, these 360-degree paintings that would bring people in to see the spectacle of this proto-cinema, but also lead them to go in to places where they could go to an ice cream shop or have lunch, café glace, déjeuner, go to various fashionable shops, buy clothing and the like, past the Théâtre des Variétés in this slightly later view of the passage of the panoramas. So I end there commercially. As we can see, certainly all class distinctions are not gone, but there is an architecture that has been created for and by citoyens, but also by a radically changing market as much as by a radically changing political situation. So thank you very much for listening to me as I talk to you through my screen without the pleasure of seeing you. I hope that won't be in the too distant future. And I think there's time, it's about 7:15, time for maybe 3 or 4 questions. Mark Hewitt asks a really terrific question, which is, did the rationalization of space also manifest itself in the École Polytechnique, Gaspard Monge's descriptive geometry, and Durand's grids? And absolutely, most certainly, it's one of many facets of this decade that I could have had there. The École Polytechnique was founded during this decade to train engineers, and ultimately as well to train military engineers who would, under Napoleon, be involved in surveying territory and quickly deploying what was needed, a kind of revolutionary successor to the École des Ponts et Chaussées, the School of Roads and Bridges of the Old Royalty, which also continued. It was there, of course, where Gaspard Monge taught descriptive geometry. It was there where Doron began to have the students use the first pre-printed graph paper. At first, one had to make one's own. And so this rationalization that I spoke about at the very beginning of space and time, whether it be the space of the project or the time of its execution, very much came together in the teaching and the preparation of engineers in the École Polytechnique. So clearly I have exhausted you, or you are worried by the real upheaval outside your doors and windows. If there are no other questions, I will thank you for listening so attentively, and for those who have the patience for yet another Zoom encounter, to invite you back on the 15th of July, and I'll be giving a talk on Gilli and Schinkel's Berlin, which will take us from Gilli's encounter with Paris through the transformation of Berlin in the first decades of the 19th century. Thanks very much, everyone.